Okay, well, it's great to have Kate Lister back. She made a great presentation to us back in May of 2020, and a lot's happened since then um, on the issue of remote work and telework. As for me, I'm a planner and urban designer, recently retired. Um, I've been a member of the board of directors of Livable California for since 2017. And I'm past president of the California Planning Roundtable, a think tank of public and private planners that weighs in on the issues of the day affecting our profession. But Kate, I really want to welcome you to the group, and perhaps as an introduction, you could tell us, we have a lot of new people in this session than we had before, about what you're doing, what work global workplace analytics does, and the work that you're focusing on their behalf.
Sure. I'm president of Global Workplace Analytics. For the last almost 20 years, I've been pushing the remote work rock uphill. And in the last 2 years, it's been chasing me down the other side. So over the years, I've gathered over 6,000 documents, everything I can put my eyeballs on that has to do with not just remote work, but lots of different workplace strategies and how they affect people, planet, and profit. I was asked to testify before Congress last year regarding telework in government, and I've done some work with government agencies. They were really looking at, should we and why should we continue telework after the pandemic is over? I also testified before the Hoover Commission on this topic, and for the last 2 years have really been doing nothing but working with medium to large organizations, 3,000 to 10,000 employees, trying to help them figure out what their return to office strategy should be and how they want to operate in the future.
Fascinating. Well, since May of 2020, which was at the height of the original COVID pandemic, you revealed a number of trends that telework is here to stay. Uh, is You still feel that's the case? And um, have those trends changed in any way since? And if so, how?
Yeah, I'm just going to share because I've got a lot of numbers here, and this data just came out this week from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So rather than trying to say a bunch of numbers and have you not understand what I'm talking about, I just put together a few quick
Great,
slides.
great.
So at the peak of the pandemic, about 60% of the workforce was working from home full time or nearly full time. Right now, that number is at about 30%. It grew to maybe 45% last November until the next variant hit. And in terms of who wants to, there has just been dozens of studies that have come out over the last year. And academic, non-academic. I've done some that I call pracademic. They all come out to the same thing. They all say that about 80% of those who have jobs that are eligible to work from home want to continue to do it. Now, interestingly, that number hasn't changed in the last 15 years. It's always been about 80%. The difference now is that employees feel empowered to ask for it, and not only ask for it, but demand it. I think if we weren't in a talent shortage, this would be a much different situation, but that's where we are right now. In general, about 20% want to be in the office full time. About 20 to 30% want to be at home full time. This is what employees want. And then the rest are in that middle ground, that hybrid ground. So some of the things that have happened, we've always found in the past that the thing that convinces managers to support remote work is having done it themselves. And so I predicted at the beginning of the pandemic that the longer this goes on, the more likely it was that managers were going to turn around and support this. Because historically, since the 1970s, when Jack Nillis in California first invented the term telework and telecommuting, the thing that's been holding it back for the last many decades is managers not supporting it, largely because they don't trust their employees. I mean, is really what it comes down to. But then when they've done it themselves, and we've shown this historically, they're more inclined to support it. So, I think we really started to see a turn, I would say late 20, early 2021. And I even saw it in some of my clients and in some of the polling. So, we'll go into a company and the first thing we do is a survey. And we can parse it by managers and employees. And they were still pretty skeptical in late 2020. And then in early 2021, it's like well, for one thing, they got it. And on the other thing is they heard a lot of companies declaring that they were going to be remote first, or all remote, or, they just saw these companies adopting it and started realizing, wow, if we want to compete for talent, we're going to have to get on this boat.
Your mention of managers and the management group, back in 2020, when you made your presentation to us, you indicated that the management level needed to make better adjustments to be more accepting of remote work. Has that happened?
Uh, I would say about 70% are convinced, and that remaining 30%, forgive me, tends to be gray-haired. I got some too. And, it's just that historical manager who was brought up in the command and control environment that feels like we need to have our people close, or I need to see the back of their heads, and that's not management, that's babysitting. Martha Johnson, who headed the USGSA when they made their move to remote work and transformed one of their downtown offices for GSA into a facility that held 2,500 to a facility that held 4,000, as a result of going to unassigned desks and as a result of integrating remote work. And she had a line that I just love: remote work doesn't create management problems, it reveals them. And so what it reveals is managers who don't know how to manage their remote workers, or in fact don't know how to manage even their on-site workers, because they're managing them by in false ways, by seeing them sitting there. The highest online shopping happens during working hours. So that tells you that they don't really know they're working. Fortunately, though, those that are sort of going into this now with an intentional attitude are realizing that they have to have training, that they need to retrain their people to work remotely. And I'm a little bit worried as we move into hybrid that companies are going to feel like, oh, well, we did remote. This will be easy peasy going back to the office. And that's just not true. It's actually going to be a lot harder to do hybrid than it was to do remote. Primarily because of issues of equity, not creating a second class of the people that are not in the office. And a lot of the work that we do is coaching management and leadership that they really need to be intentional to avoid that.
As telework matures as a phenomenon, what trends do you foresee in the future for it?
Yeah, let me just say one other thing about managers. The other thing that we found, all of the studies found over the last 2 years, is that productivity actually increased. Only 14% of managers say that they feel like productivity decreased, and the majority of them feel that it increased. The surveys show that collaboration has been maintained, innovation has been maintained. I was on a panel with the head of HR at Juniper Networks the other day, and they said their rollout of new products has just been phenomenal. They've been so much better able to get work done as a result of the remote relationship. weak ties, the people we sort of know outside of our network but don't know well, those have become weaker. So that's bad. Strong ties, the people in our own networks have become stronger. And the it's just disproven a lot of the myths, and we have a lot of data on it now. Just because these things, companies are worried that they're losing culture. And these are things that we can work at. These are things. This doesn't mean this is a bad thing. It means these are things that we need to figure out. And what a lot of companies are doing is completely changing their footprint, going to unassigned desks, and instead of the sort of traditional model of 70% me space, individual desks, and 30% we space, social areas and meeting rooms and all of that. They're flipping that on its head and saying, okay, what are people going to come to the office for? They're not going to come here and sit on a Zoom meeting, right? They're not going to come here and do heads down work. That's going to be done at home in the future. And what's going to be done in the office is the collaborative work and reinforcing those bonds. Also, I want to say that work-life balance has proven to be much better for individuals. Stress, of course, is very, very high, and this is something that organizations are concerned with. But we've been dealing with a lot in the last 2 years. In fact, the highest cause of stress is not work. It tends to be around financial security and health worries and those kinds of things. So, back to your question of what's this going to mean for the future. Historically, that when companies get into remote work, they want to do it kind of slowly. Okay, let's do 1 day a week. Okay, let's do 2 days a week. And then as they get more comfortable with it, they do it more frequently. And so I think what we're going to see, in fact, I have another slide I want to show you on that, is that right now managers want their people in the office. They're leaning toward the 3 to 4 day a week. Employees are leaning toward wanting to be in the office 1 to 2 days a week. And the middle ground is where it's always been for people that have worked remotely, and that's about half of the time. But I think we're going to see a kind of a slow start, and then we'll move to more frequency. So this data that just came out from Bureau of Labor Statistics the other day is absolutely fascinating. And I pulled the California numbers this morning. So 38% of California businesses increased telework during the pandemic. The national average was 34%. 67% of those companies say that they will continue. It was kind of a vague, what they really meant about what they were going to continue, but will continue the increase. The question they also asked, have you left your state? Have you left your region? Do you plan to in the next 12 months? And this last survey was fielded between July and November of last year. And the net migration out of California is 65,000 establishments, 65,000 businesses, 7.2%. It's only exceeded by Puerto Rico and DC. So we're seeing a very, very strong net migration out. Another 27,000 establishments say they're going to move out of their city or county, but stay within California. And the other thing it asked is, are you going to increase space or decrease space? And the net decrease in space was about 6%. So, we're going to see a lot of shifting within California, outside of California. California has always been a state that employers want to avoid. Remote work employers often have rules that you can work in a number of states, but you can't work in California. And so, I think this has really big implications for our state.
Before I retired, I was essentially the senior shareholder in an architecture planning and engineering firm based in San Luis Obispo with about 175 employees. And since then, the new generation of leadership has gone to an employee-owned business model. And of that 175 employees, Only 15 are working in the office at any one time. And also, the strategy of the firm was to establish some remote offices where people enjoyed living and could work from.
Mm.
What trends are you seeing in the establishment of remote offices?
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk about hub and spoke, you know, that there'll be kind of a downtown hub, but then there'll be these outliers in the suburbs where some of their people can gather. I haven't really seen that happening yet, and I was on a call with Gensler and HOK and a number of other big architectural firms in the last couple of weeks, and they're saying the same thing. They're not really seeing it. We're seeing a great deal more interest in co-working spaces. So, you know, formal shared workspaces. And I say interest, but not a lot of commitment yet. And the commitment was tepid before the pandemic. But, you know, for that 20% of people that can't or don't want to work at home, it does offer an alternative. And we're starting to see actually a reshaping in some of those co-working places to, you know, be less coffee shop and beer places, and more along the lines of what were considered shared offices back in the 70s and 80s. So a little bit more conservative than the traditional co-working space. We're not really seeing a flight to the suburbs. I mean, you keep in mind, a lot of companies are in 20-year leases, and a lot of companies have commitments to their wherever they're located because the incentives that were offered to them and so forth. So this is something that's going to take quite a bit of time. A lot of the companies that maybe do want to leave can't get rid of their real estate, can't sublet it because everybody else is sort of in the same position. We're seeing some organic get-togethers outside of the city centers. So, hey, you know, I work in Walnut Creek. Do you work in Walnut? And so employees are actually putting together kind of let's meet up here or whatever.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Um, Back in May of 2020, you had indicated that most of your findings were based on white collar workers. Where do blue collar workers fit into this mix?
Yeah, that's a toughie. Were we talking to companies before the pandemic about whether they want to do a remote work program? What we would typically be talking about is a flexibility program. So, you know, think of all of the types of flexibility that you can offer because not everybody wants to work at home. Not everybody can work at home. So even things, you know, call centers have even experimented with giving their people the opportunity to choose when they wanted to take their break. And it made a huge difference in productivity and in morale. And so there are little things that companies can do in some of the industries that don't have this opportunity to make their lives better too. I mean, because we really are, we really are in the employees are in charge right now. You know, go to any Starbucks and you know you'll see that they're short staffed and everybody's going a little bit crazy. I also think that we really have to concentrate on upskilling the blue collar workers. The BLS report that I mentioned also has a section on did you increase automation or robotics or you know anything like that during the pandemic, and there was a good bit of it. And you know, as we've known for years and years and years, there will continue to be, and will be a lot of the lower end jobs will be replaced. So we've
The,
got to be thinking about upskilling.
um, how the big tech companies were considered to be one of the main fuels behind the YIMBY movement and densification of single family zoning. How have big tech companies made the adjustment with telework, or have they?
They're kind of in a wait and see. I do have a slide here on the breakdown of the industries that where we saw telework during the pandemic, and of course, education, information, financial services, professional services, all of the service firms. But I mean, look at wholesale trade. That's pretty big, and you can see that there's every one of these has uh, there are roles that can be done remotely, maybe not full time, but at least part of the time. So, now the employers are asking themselves, well, okay, why do we have to have a headquarters? Why do we have to, some of the companies were putting in, company housing, if you will, and giving incentives for people to locate near the office. Now, if we can hire the best and the brightest from anywhere, why does it really matter? Why do we have to have an office in California, or wherever it might be? Why do we have to provide housing when people can move to places where the housing is cheaper?
Governor Newsom just announced a $10.7 billion housing budget proposal that's going to double down on densifying California's urban areas, primarily its largest urban areas, targeted toward climate goals, increasing mass transit, and reducing vehicle miles traveled. But all of this seems to ignore the notion of telework trends and the exodus of population from California's major urban areas. What do you think this budget might do to have any impact on teleworking?
I mean, there are going to be winners and losers in this, and cities, particularly, and not all cities, but certain cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, are going to see a major exit of
They
work.
already are, yeah.
And then as a result, the small businesses that support them, one of the problems companies are having in terms of bringing their people back is that all those places they used to go to lunch and get other services are now closed. And so they're feeling, hey, do we have to up our our lunchroom or whatever, because they don't have that option to go to those places anymore. So, like if I looked at this in 10 years, or I said on average, I think it'll be better. It will fine, but we don't live in averages. I've got one hand in a bucket of hot water and one hand in a bucket of cold water, and on average, that doesn't make me warm. And I'm afraid that that's kind of going to be the case in a lot of the blue collar, the small businesses. You could obviously see that if we retreat to the suburbs, then those businesses may be able to move to the suburbs, but that interim part's going to be very difficult. And how do you pay for public transit? If we've got less cars on the road, although that's the one thing that hasn't really come true, of the predictions that I made. We saw phenomenal cleanup of the air, right, and water in those first several months. But the traffic started coming back, and this has been a prediction for a number of years from the climate people, is that the traffic will always rise to a certain level, because once it starts to go down, people who wouldn't have otherwise gotten on the roads will, they'll get in their car and go somewhere. Um, the difference, and one of the things that is still valid in terms of climate, is that the congestion has changed. So the most congestion is one of the most polluting kinds of traffic. So that will help. But we're definitely. I mean, I got rid of a car. Why do we need two cars? And a number of my friends did. So how do you pay for those highways, to keep those highways? And should you be investing in subways and public transportation when that's been the people don't want to go back to it? They're afraid of it. They're afraid of the cleanliness of it.
Well, and also you're getting urban crime on public transportation.
Yeah.
Since the pandemic hit, telecommuting and flight from urban areas have been on the rise. The urban flight phenomenon seems partially fueled by the desire of younger Californians to enjoy the American dream of home ownership in a safe neighborhood with areas where your kids can play and where you can live where you work rather than work where you live.
Mm-hmm.
or work where you lived rather than live with your where you work. Do you see this trend continuing?
Well, it was already starting before the pandemic, and it was in part a response to the aging of the Gen X and them beginning to have children, which tends to lead them to the suburbs. So that had started to happen, and like so many things, the pandemic has accelerated it. Excuse me.
Oh,
Uh, I'm sorry. The question. What was your question again?
well, just the whole issue of younger Californians
Oh,
seeking the opportunity for home ownership, which is pretty much priced out in major urban areas.
yeah, and so we definitely are seeing that they represent the biggest group of those who have moved during the pandemic. There's this issue of what's the company going to do? Are you going to be able to move from Walnut Creek to somewhere in Tennessee and maintain your $250,000 salary, or is your employer going to peg your salary to your location, which many employers have for many years? The big tech companies are very worried about that, particularly if it's somebody who already moved. You know, if they were hiring somebody from Tennessee, it might be different. But you know, you've got this person that has moved there. What are you going to do? You're going to knock their salary down 50%? Not during a talent shortage. You're not going to. But there's still about, I would say, 30 to 40% of companies that are leaning toward the location-based pay, which may reduce the incentive to move out of some of those expensive cities if what you wanted to do was take that big salary and live somewhere less expensive. But you know, certainly the ability to move out of Walnut Creek, and some companies are saying, okay, you've got to be located within 2 hours drive of the office or 2 hours travel
Um,
to the office.
a big chunk of Newsom's housing budget is going toward grants and pass-throughs from state government to local councils or regional councils of government, like ABAG, SANDAG, SCAG. Um, and interestingly enough, SCAG actually endorsed the our Neighborhood Voices initiative to bring back local control to local government over land use planning. But ABAG has just totally rejected an attempt to request them to endorse the notion of telework. Um, how can that turn around?
It's been a huge problem in California. I mean, California led the way in this 20, 30 years ago. And the political climate since has been very much against it. I am seeing a little bit of a change. I live in San Diego County, and I stood before Sandag 18 years ago and said some of the transportation monies ought to go to supporting telework and encouraging telework and doing training and those kinds of things. And they just really didn't have an interest. They've done a couple of little pilot programs, but I have worked with some other areas of California, Santa Barbara. I forget what the other one was, where they are very much encouraging companies and doing it with tax incentives. If you think of the internet as the transportation highway of the future, that's what you use to get to work, then it deserves just as much support in terms of infrastructure as do the highways and the public transportation and so forth. I mean, San Diego, we're building a public transportation system that won't be done for a decade or more, and there's not going to be anybody using it. I don't want to get political. Never mind.
With SB 9 and SB 10 increasing the development potential and hence the value of every single family home in California, how will younger Californians ever be able to afford the American dream of home ownership, even with telework?
Yeah, I mean they're going to have to leave California, and there's a difficulty there. Several the labor laws and the tax laws have not begun to keep pace with even the mobility that we had before the the pandemic, and certainly not now. So California, for example, doesn't have a reciprocal agreement with other states, so that if I move from my place in San Francisco and move outside of the state, I'm still going to owe state taxes. And if I'm out of the state and working for an employer out of state and I move into the state, then I'm going to owe taxes in both places. A lot of states have this reciprocal agreement where you just pay us and we'll work it out with the other state. But we don't. We also have much more stringent labor laws and nexus laws, so that if a company has one person, and I'm exaggerating here, but I may not be, moves into the state, it establishes a nexus, meaning the company then has to have a headquarters, they've got to pay taxes, potentially exposes them to sales tax that they wouldn't have to pay. All of our labor laws, which are pretty much acknowledged as some of the most employee-centric in the country, discourage companies from wanting to locate here. And if they have, again, that opportunity to hire the best and the brightest from anywhere, why wouldn't they just move to a state that doesn't make it so hard for them?
And our governor seems to want to make, or at least this budget says so, he wants everybody to live in dense urban areas. And there are a number of state legislators as well as local officials in inland California expressing grave concern about being left out in the cold. What could our state legislature propose as new legislation to facilitate telework, broadband, and geographic equity of work opportunities? Are you aware of any legislators who are thinking about this? And how could we possibly approach them to suggest solutions to the problem?
Yeah, there are about 10 states that actually have a program that incentivizes people to move, both companies and people to move into their state if they have a telework job. So,
Really?
yeah, Utah will pay you 10,000. No, I'm sorry, not Salt Lake City. Somewhere in Oklahoma will pay you $10,000 to move there. This is an individual. Will provide training for you. Some will provide tax incentives. Some hold a lottery of how many people they'll bring in, and you have to stay there for a certain number of years, and you have to continue to work remotely. So, a lot of the rural states are seeing this as a real opportunity to increase their standard of living, where they didn't have access to jobs with Salesforce and Twitter and Google and all the rest. Now they do, and they're really pitching to get people to come live in their community. So there's those kinds of things we can do. We also have to keep in mind that a lot of people in those rural communities don't want the people coming out of Walnut Creek. They come in with their big salaries, and then their houses become more expensive, and they're having to live with a different crowd. There's also a redistricting issue because there's a difference between Republican and Democratic Democrat use of telework, and so if we've got mostly jobs that are the at the high end of the wage spectrum, that are moving to certain places or moving out of certain places, that's going to result in a very different political scenario.
Well, I really appreciate all the answers you've given. I'm going to ask Isaiah Madison, who's a member of our board of directors as well, our Berkeley grad, to ask you a couple of questions. But before I ask you a final one, is there a question I haven't asked you that you would like to answer?
Perhaps back to the what could the state do? Allow some of the use of the DOT dollars to go to support telework, offer incentives, rethink zoning, because we're going to have a lot of downtown areas now, downtown buildings that are zoned for commercial that potentially could be transformed, and in some places are being transformed into either mixed use or residential.
Yep.
Things like parking lots. We're going to have a lot of empty parking lots. What do we do with those? So I think we need to be a little bit more nimble about those kinds of things. Even in some places, co-living is is becoming the way to afford housing. Um,
Well, thank you.
yeah,
Isaiah?
Thanks. I don't have much questions, but I do have a question. Um, I'm just wondering if you study like the demographics of uh, the effects of the pandemic. I'm just kind of wondering, um, is there a particular like age group or maybe a combination of age and industry, maybe it's a student group that you feel is going to be most negatively affected by the pandemic in the long run?
yeah, I do worry about Gen Z, um, because and they've been the younger population have been those who have not liked telework the most. I said that poorly. They're having the hardest time. Uh, and that's because typically they don't have the space that somebody older has. So, they're working at a dining room table alongside their wife and children or, whatever. And also because, we meet our spouses at work. And, for younger people, work is a big part of their social life. And then the other element, and I've got a law firm that I'm working with is very worried about this, is that whole mentorship. Even if we do come into the office, it's the senior people that don't, that they want their people to be there, but they're not going to be there, right? I want to be operating from Bar Harbor while my people are working in New York. How are they going to get the mentorship? How are they going to get that sort of subtle training that comes from being side by side? I think technology is going to solve a lot of this, but I think that's where the biggest risk lies. I also think a bigger risk lies with women who have had a harder time than other populations during the pandemic, because of the burden of both childcare and homeschooling and all of that. And people of color have also had a harder time, and both populations are actually more inclined to continue working remotely. And so if now we have, if we do create this second class of citizens, and people who are working from home are not getting the raises that people that are working in the office are, then we're just going to see a bigger and bigger divide.
Okay, so do you think that the pandemic as a whole is going to lead to decreased productivity? Because it seems like there are some things that have been good from the pandemic, work from home, but there seems mostly like negative things. So do you think that this is going to reflect in our economy in the long run, just because people aren't forming the mentoring relationships and yeah.
I don't. There are a handful of 1,000 to 2,000 person companies that have been all remote from the start, or that have gone all remote, and they have learned how to onboard differently, how to mentor differently. Salesforce, for example, just bought a sprawling resort, and that's where they're going to physically onboard all of their people, and also use as a place that they can gather. And that's one of the techniques that these all virtual companies use, is to have these get-togethers once or twice a year to reinforce those cultural bonds. Uh, there's nothing I have seen in 20 years that suggests that productivity is going to go down. There's kind of a myth of innovation, that innovation is going to you can't innovate unless you're in a room of people. The science says the exact opposite, that at least half of the innovation process is something that you do solo. I mean, you think about it, when do you have your best ideas? In the car, or in the shower, walking the dog or whatever. And I think that from the architectural point of view, I'm just hearing a lot of much greater concern about people. How do we make the places and spaces of work for people? how do we make them happier? How do we make them healthier? Much more concern about people's health and how you make places physically more healthy.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. We learned so much about agglomeration in school, and I just kind of like Keith was referring to how tech has really been the driver of YIMBYism. It just seems like they're so obsessed with cramming everyone into um, like this space so that they can all bounce off of each other. So that's why I'm like, how is this pandemic gonna affect this goal of theirs?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we're seeing is the square foot per person is going up. We learned that open plan didn't work. Nobody liked it, and it wasn't conducive to producing good work. There's much more of a sense of wanting to measure that now. Are, are we offering the kind of space that allow people to do their best work?
Yeah. All right. Maybe let's take some questions.